Britain and Russia are at war in everything but name, and most people have absolutely no idea it's going on. This is not the kind of war that features tanks rolling through London or air raid sirens blaring in Moscow. After all, that's, at least at the time of this video, reserved for the ongoing war in Ukraine. No, the war between the UK and Russia is a 21st century, wide-reaching geopolitical conflict happening right now across cyberspace, financial markets, undersea cables, and shadow operations spanning 3 continents. So let's dig into how this happened and how Britain can shape its future. While you were scrolling through social media this morning, Russian hackers were attempting to infiltrate British network infrastructure, much as they did almost every day since 2022. While you commuted to work, MI6 operatives were conducting covert operations that Sir Richard Moore, the agency's chief, openly admits are designed with helping Ukraine resist the Russian invasion in mind. And while you watch this video, Russian agents are likely planning what would be the 21st assassination attempt that we know of on British soil since 2022. That's according to MI5's latest threat assessment. This isn't hyperbole. This is warfare reimagined in an era where nuclear weapons make traditional conflict impossible. Both sides have therefore moved the battlefield to domains most citizens can't see, but whose effects touch every aspect of daily life. Let's turn back the clock a bit to demystify what exactly we mean by Britain being at war with Russia. The entire conflict harkens back to the long-standing rivalry between Russia and NATO. Ever since Vladimir Putin became president of the Russian Federation in 2000, he has maintained a belief that Western policies, values, and geopolitical aspirations go against core Russian ideology. Namely, the slow but steady expansion of NATO has resulted in most of the European nations that were either part of the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union itself joining the alliance throughout the 1990s and 2000s. At its core, NATO represents the embodiment of liberal internationalism, the belief that lasting peace depends on democracies working together through collective security. As such, the alliance eschews solitary displays of power and amassing critical amounts of military capability, apart from the US being a notable exception. Instead, it's effectively gradually demilitarizing Europe, simply due to the fact that the alliance's combined military is the largest and most technologically and logistically capable in the world. This trend has been reversed directly due to Russia's actions, which we'll discuss a bit later. But without it, it's entirely possible that NATO would continue to rely on the US and its quality over quantity approach for its troops and military capabilities that even seep into nuclear deterrence systems. NATO saw its eastward spread as a direct continuation of this trend, removing physical and geopolitical barriers in Europe that would lead to democracy-led peace. On the other hand, Putin saw this as a direct threat to Russia's influence, eroding its presence on the world stage as one of the largest economies, exporters, and militaries. Simultaneously, Putin considered the gradual degradation or lack of significant investment in the European military as something that represented inherent weaknesses, one that he thought he would be able to exploit during his time as the leader of Russia. This conflict of interests stewed for decades, with diplomacy between Russia and NATO ebbing and flowing from a positive outlook to neutrality to what we're currently seeing as a renewed Cold War. Ultimately, when Ukraine became the next logical step of EU and NATO expansion, Russia decided that was one step too far. This resulted in a conflict that would last for well over a decade and ultimately culminate in an all-out war between Russia and Ukraine, a conflict where NATO would be practically forced to join by proxy. However, Russia wouldn't stop at threatening just Ukraine, but also try to diminish NATO's relevance and economic standing. With that in mind, instead of outright suicidal military missions, Russia turned to cyber warfare and geopolitical machinations. While the initial strikes were relatively benign, or at least underreported, they peaked in 2017 when the Russian GRU, their military intelligence service, launched what was commonly called the most destructive cyber attack in history, NotPetya. The attack primarily targeted Ukraine's infrastructure, but spilled to over 100 countries in total, and also hit some of Russia's most prominent companies, state oil firm Rosneft. It's estimated that NotPetya caused over $10 billion in global damages, crippling companies worldwide. The attack showed that Russia had the capability to hit Europe, the US, and the rest of the world where it hurts, its economic systems, supply chains, and vital companies. But that was just one attack in an entire barrage. British infrastructure faces what the National Cybersecurity Centre describes as daily attacks from Russian state actors. One notable example of successful attacks was the Star Blizzard campaign, which was a long-standing operation either directly conducted or supported by Russia since at least 2019, and which comprised UK-US trade documents that were strategically leaked before the 2019 UK general election. They hacked former International Trade Minister Liam Fox's personal communications and penetrated British anti-disinformation think tanks, Russian GRU units have maintained sustained campaigns against British organizations supporting Ukraine, employing credential guessing, spearphishing, and exploitation of Microsoft Exchange systems. But here's what makes this true warfare rather than mere espionage: the systematic targeting of critical infrastructure. Russian hackers demonstrated their capabilities against power grids in their 2015 attack on Ukraine, using malware specifically designed to attack energy systems, and that left 230,000 people in Kyiv without electricity. The same malware, called Crash Override or Industroyer, is theoretically capable of targeting Britain's power infrastructure. But apart from attempts to take down Britain's cyber defenses, the scope of this so-called shadow war has exploded beyond anything seen since the Cold War. Russian agents have conducted 20 potentially lethal plots on British soil in just 2 years, using military-grade nerve agents like Novichok, the same chemical weapon that killed British citizen Dawn Sturgis in Salisbury. Russian spy networks have infiltrated British society so thoroughly that MI5 has uncovered sleeper cells operating from seaside towns like Great Yarmouth, using hidden cameras in ties and surveillance equipment disguised as everyday objects. Russian operatives are also recruiting domestic criminal elements to conduct parts of their operations. This has the effect of reducing their capabilities and overall professionalism, as domestic actors don't have the connections and deep pocket inherent in Russia's extensive KGB-supported network. However, using Britain's people to conduct disinformation and offensive crime campaigns increases Russia's deniability and prevents local law enforcement from ever rooting out the source of the problem. Essentially, Russia has managed to perform undercover terrorist attacks on British soil, all the while using the British population as cover. British surveillance services don't have the same level of sophistication and penetration into Russia's governing centers, making this an asymmetric effort. But while cyber attacks only sporadically make the newspapers, there's another aspect of this shadow war that is even less known, but has much more tangible consequences, especially for the regular Brit. We are of course talking about economic warfare. One of the most notable examples is the economic crash fueled by the temporary energy crisis in Europe. When Russia launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, one of Europe's first recourses was to try to cut off Russia's economic supply, namely by heavily reducing its dependence on Russia's oil and gas. Before the conflict, Russia supplied 38% of Europe's natural gas and 24.9% of the EU's total fuel needs. As soon as the war started, Gazprom, one of Russia's biggest exporters of oil and gas products, cut off gas pipelines from the Russian mainland to Europe, weaponizing its gas supply to create political pressure and prevent Europe from retaliating against Russia in its ongoing campaign against Ukraine. This effort didn't make much of an impact at first, as the cutoff came at the height of summer when the energy and gas requirements were at their lowest. During that time, Europe broadened its imports, bringing in Norway and the US as key trading partners to bypass its dependence on Russia. As a result, Gazprom reported a net loss of almost $7 billion in 2023, marking its first annual loss in more than 20 years. The European Union and the UK moved quickly to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. Russia's share of the bloc's total imports of natural gas fell to 19% in 2024, from 45% in 2021, while Moscow accounted for just 3% of the EU's total imports in 2024, down from 27% at the start of 2022. However, Europe's energy independence came at an enormous cost, and the scale of energy bill increases in the UK was historically unprecedented. Typical household energy bills increased by 54% in April 2022 and 27% in October 2022. Ofgem, the UK's Office for Gas and Fuel Markets, announced that as of October 1, 2022, a consumer on an average dual-fuel default tariff paying by direct debit would see their energy bills rise from £1,971 per year to £3,549. Other independent estimates suggested that the average taxpayer needed to shell out more than £5,000 per year on energy costs in 2023. This was a direct consequence of the UK and the rest of Europe importing vital energy products from more expensive markets, as well as Russia trying to ramp up prices to keep its war machine fed as its tactical efforts in Ukraine kept failing one after another. As a result, the cost of living increased sharply across the UK during the first year of the war, with the annual rate of inflation peaking at 11.1% in October 2022, a 41-year high. Even with subsequent economic programs to slowly reduce the cost of energy in the UK, it's likely that they won't go down to pre-war levels within the next 20 years. But while Russia waged an energy war on Europe, the UK retaliated with a trade war on its own. By November 2022, the UK imports from Russia had plummeted to just £18 million, a staggering 98.2% decrease from pre-war levels. That's millions with an M rather than the traditional billions in which bilateral trade is measured between major economies, as both the UK and Russia ranked among the top 15 economies of the world by most meaningful measures. To put that in perspective, Britain now imports more goods in a single day from Germany than it does from Russia in an entire year. This wasn't just about cutting off Russian caviar and vodka. Russia has become the most sanctioned country in the world, with over 2,300 individuals and entities subject to UK sanctions alone, in what amounts to systematic economic strangulation. The EU has implemented 18 different sanctions packages, with Britain following suit, targeting everything from oligarch yachts to semiconductor technology that powers Russian military equipment. And the most important part of this side of economic warfare is that it has been deeply asymmetric, with Britain holding the cards. Russia scrambled to find alternative markets and has been forced to rely on a shadow fleet of tankers, aging vessels with obscure ownership that are uninsured and often environmentally unsound. However, Europe had the economic and geopolitical stability to seek new markets in developed countries, specifically from its existing allies in the region. Norwegian gas replaced Russian gas. American technology replaced Russian imports. The UK's economy barely felt the disruption, while Russia's integration with the global financial system has been systematically dismantled. Think of it this way: London's financial sector, one of the world's largest, essentially locked Russian entities out of international markets overnight. Britain froze over £25 billion of Russia's assets, amounting to a sizable chunk of the latter's pre-war national defense budget. 7 major Russian banks have been cut from SWIFT, the international financial messaging network, which forced Russia to develop alternative financial systems. This resulted in the country relying on less sophisticated domestic and Chinese financial systems, effectively shrinking its global economic reach. The sanctions aren't just about punishment, they're trying to permanently reduce Russia's capacity to project power globally. What makes this economic warfare particularly devastating is its sophistication. New regulations introduced in April 2025 ban not just goods but sectoral software and technology transfers, meaning Russia can't access the digital infrastructure that modern economies depend on. It's like cutting off not just trade, but the very nervous system of international commerce. But apart from the economic warfare, actual war has been a catalyst for a broader Russia-Britain conflict, even if via proxy. The war in Ukraine shattered a comfortable illusion that had dominated Western thinking for decades, that major conventional warfare was a relic of the past. European militaries previously mainly trained for peacekeeping missions and asymmetric conflicts, where they will be able to exert immediate aerial and naval superiority. However, Russia deployed massive tank columns, nearly endless artillery barrages, and swarms of attack drones. Ukraine countered with one of the biggest overhauls of military-industrial complexes seen in the world, producing a fleet of combat drones that the West could only dream about. The revelation was sobering and worrying for Europe. Most NATO allies had gutted their defense industries during the post-Cold War peace dividend, operating under the assumption that the US would handle any serious threats, while the policy of combined defense would provide enough of a deterrent. When Ukraine desperately needed ammunition and advanced weapons, European production capacities quickly hit their limits. Britain alone wouldn't be able to sustain a conflict on a similar scale for more than a few months with existing supplies. But this wake-up call triggered the most dramatic military transformation in British history since 1945. Defense Secretary John Healey announced plans for defense spending to hit 2.5% of GDP by 2027, to reach 3% in the next parliament. This is an extra £13 billion per year, based on 2025 numbers, constituting the biggest increase in defense spending since the Cold War. This isn't just about buying more tanks and planes. The UK plans to develop a 6th-generation crewed fighter jet capable of operating in tandem with drones, essentially creating a hybrid force where human pilots command swarms of autonomous aircraft. This is especially important given the prevalence of drone warfare in the war in Ukraine, significantly plummeting the costs of developing and deploying weapons where there's minimal risk to human operators involved. The Royal Navy will get a dozen new nuclear attack submarines alongside autonomous patrol ships that can operate without human crews for extended periods. The Ukrainian conflict has become NATO's, and to an extent Britain's, laboratory for next-generation warfare. UK-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles have proven devastatingly effective against Russian command centers hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, demonstrating the game-changing potential of precision long-range strikes. The UK has also been pivotal in supplying, structuring, and funding prototypes that would be directly deployed on the front lines to test their effectiveness in real-time situations against Russia's extant capabilities. This growth of UK military ambitions becomes more understandable when you look at it through the lens of international relations between NATO countries, specifically the US and European members. Just when Europe thought it had America's unwavering support against Russian aggression, Donald Trump's return to the presidency has triggered the most serious crisis in NATO's 75-year history. What happened in Trump's first 100 days in office wasn't just a policy shift, but a fundamental realignment that threatened to shatter the transatlantic alliance. Trump's advisors were openly discussing forcing Moscow and Kyiv into negotiations by halting military aid to Ukraine unless Kyiv agrees to talk, while simultaneously taking NATO membership for Ukraine completely off the table. This represents exactly the kind of appeasement that encouraged Putin's aggression in the first place. The relations between the US and Ukraine sank so low that the US withdrew from peace talks entirely, all the while blaming Ukraine and Russia for failing to come up with agreeable terms for ceasefire. Ukraine was given no assurances that the country would be protected by NATO against further Russian aggression. Russia failed to make good on efforts to establish even partial or temporary ceasefires. Even more troubling, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced that Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine, while reiterating Trump's calls for NATO allies to increase defense spending from 2% to 5% of GDP. Even previous defense spending levels were barely matched by most members, and only became so due to years-long pressure from the US and the sudden realization that Russia is all but waiting to exploit existing vulnerabilities in Europe's lack of military quantity. European officials have drawn parallels between Trump's approach and the disastrous 1938 speech from then UK Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Just as Chamberlain's concessions to Hitler encouraged further aggression under the veneer of peace in our time, Trump's willingness to accommodate Putin's demands is being interpreted in Moscow as a crucial weakness and institutional dissolution of NATO's core values. With America proving unreliable, Europe's two nuclear powers are under pressure to step into a leadership role. France and the United Kingdom possess 290 and 225 nuclear warheads respectively. That's only 515 compared to Russia's estimated 4,309, out of which 1,700 are deployed and ready to be launched on a 30-minute notice at most. On paper this looks like a mismatch. In reality, it might be enough. The mathematics of nuclear deterrence aren't about matching warhead counts, but about credible and effective retaliation. Both France and the United Kingdom should have sufficient strategic weapons to cause irreparable damage to Moscow and St. Petersburg, with weapons carried by constantly patrolling nuclear submarines that are highly likely to survive a first strike attack. Considering Russia's highly centralized power structure, it's much more susceptible to a limited salvo of nuclear warheads striking key population centers. What's historically unprecedented is how quickly this nuclear partnership has developed. In a high-stakes meeting in London on March 24, 2025, British and French military chiefs convened to chart a new course for European security, centering on a European-led coalition of the willing to provide long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. Even more dramatic is France's about-face on nuclear doctrine. President Emmanuel Macron proposed that he would be open to having France and the UK take the lead in nuclear deterrence for the entire region. He added that he wants to believe that the US, which has nuclear-armed aircraft in Europe, will remain by our side, but we need to be ready if that were not the case. This shift was partially prompted by sweeping changes in Germany's geopolitical and military goalposts. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz enacted major economic policies to boost the country's spending on national defense and rearm Europe through domestic strengthening rather than international showboating. When you stop to think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Unlike the United States, France and the United Kingdom are in Europe and can't consider their security distinct from each other or Europe as a whole. Their nuclear weapons aren't just protecting their territories. If a nuclear bomb falls on Germany, Poland, the Baltics, or Scandinavia, the repercussions will be felt in France and the UK much sooner and more than across the pond. One of the biggest obstacles that Britain needs to overcome is its past economic and political downfall, mainly due to the failure that was Brexit. Brexit was supposed to unleash global Britain, a confident, independent nation forging new relationships around the world. 5 years later, Brexit has blown up Britain's role in Europe, leaving relations with the EU awkward and its role as a major economic power uncertain. The demographic maths is brutal and unchanging. Britain has fewer than 70 million people in a world where population is power. China and India have around 1.4 billion each. Even the diminished European Union still represents 450 million people. However, crises create opportunities, and the shadow war with Russia has revealed Britain's enduring strengths. The UK is one of the leading donors to Ukraine, alongside the US and Germany, having pledged £18 billion in support between February 2022 and June 2025, of which £13 billion is for military assistance. More importantly, Britain has demonstrated an ability to lead international coalitions and shape global responses to aggression. Britain's financial sector remains one of the world's 3 largest as the London stock market keeps chugging. The country's intelligence services are globally respected. These are the building blocks of soft power that can amplify military and diplomatic influence far beyond what Britain's population would suggest. And in a proxy war between 2 countries or alliances, like the one happening between Russia and Britain, or the entirety of NATO, it's the projection of power that matters most.